Welcome to another town hall with Dr. Burns. I'm your host, Thomas, and we have a wonderful guest today, Dr. James Polo. So welcome to Avamere, my friend. Same rules apply. You know the drill. If you have questions, we think you're going to have a lot of them after today. So send them to me directly in the chat, or if you don't mind people seeing your question, send it right in the chat. Doesn't matter either way to me. I want to introduce Dr. James Polo. So he's Executive Medical Director for Regence BlueCross BlueShield. He is responsible for the full integration of behavioral health programs across 4 states, Idaho, Oregon, Utah, and Washington, and regional for all Cambia Health Solutions health plan covering 3 million lives. He has a master's in business administration from the University of Colorado and a master's in strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College. And he has served numerous executive leadership positions for hospitals and healthcare systems. And I literally had to cut this down, Dr. Polo. You've done a lot more than that. So we are in great company. I don't know how that giant brain fits in that head, but welcome to the team. Welcome to our town hall. And let's get started, though, with Dr. Burns first with an update about COVID, and then we'll go into Dr. Polo. So.
Great, thanks, Thomas. I don't want to really occupy the time today. We have a really special, wonderful guest here on the line. So I just wanted to briefly give just a few updates. I know that we talked on Tuesday and talked with Rick, but just wanted to, talk a little bit about just the recent updates since then, and then kind of where we might be focusing on some more communication next week, because a lot of things are evolving, right? As we already know, COVID has just been a class in continuous medical education from the beginning, and week by week, we continue to learn more, be able to make more data-driven decisions. We're finding out new things, right, about the variants that are out there. And so with that, of course, there will be some changes down the road too. But I'll quickly update you and then we'll move on to Dr. Polo. So thanks, Thomas, for sharing. If we want to go to the next slide. So just to level set, right, I know that we talked about this on Tuesday. We continue to see a trend really over the course of the last 2 weeks where our case counts, our hospitalizations, our deaths are continuing to decline. It's twofold, right? It's due to the fact that, we've re-implemented our public health measures. The holidays really caused a significant rise, in the pandemic with the number of cases that we had. And at the same time, we've had the vaccine rolling out, and we might just start to see the tip of the iceberg here of how the vaccine is starting to impact the total volume of cases that we're seeing in our community. Next slide, Thomas. So again, I know that we talked about this on Tuesday, and while it's very promising for us to see that these case counts are continuing to go down and community transmission is starting to really decrease, we have to remember it's all relative, right? The case counts are still higher than what we saw in the 2 peaks in this pandemic. We still have a long way to go, and we have new variants that are on the rise. So again, time to double down on our public health measures and really, really get out there, get vaccinated, and encourage all of those around you to also get vaccinated too. Next slide. So when we look at the total distribution and the number of shots that have gotten into arms, right now 12% of the United States has received their first dose of the vaccine. So while we were hoping to have those numbers higher, we've been limited in many ways because of the vaccine supply, and just operationalizing it within the states has been somewhat challenging. But week after week, we continue to see a dramatic increase in the number of shots in arms, and we will continue to see that rise over the course of the next several months. I'd like to highlight again in long-term care, we've been very fortunate to be at the front of the line, to have the opportunity to get vaccinated. And at this point in time, over 6 million people in long-term care have been vaccinated. And with that said, we know now at this point, because we were early in that distribution and the uptake, we're now seeing a correlation within long-term care of the number of deaths and hospitalizations of our residents is dramatically declining, which is very much related to the vaccine itself. Next slide. So again, We're talking about number of shots in arms continues to rise, although we've seen this dramatic drop, and that is because of what we've seen across the United States just recently with the extreme weather conditions. So it's hampered about 2 weeks worth of, getting increased uptake in our communities. But we will see over the course of the next week trying to get that distribution back out to all of our communities. Next slide. And then one thing I know that's top of mind, right, to everyone, to all of us, and it's in the news on a daily basis, are the variants, and what does that mean for us? Next week, we will have some more communications out about the variants, but just quickly wanted to touch base. The three most notable variants are the UK variant, the South African variant, and the Brazil variant, and that's the order in which you see on this slide right here. We know that the UK variant, right, is highly transmissible, and it's really starting to rapidly spread. And really, when we look at our geography of where we are located in our community-based care settings and our skilled division, where we're seeing right now the highest reported numbers of the UK variant is in Colorado with 67, and Washington is behind with 19 cases. Now that's the number of reported cases. So we have to assume that the number of variants that are out there are far greater than what's currently being reported, because it's very difficult to identify who has the new variant at this point in time. And the CDC is currently working on a process right now of how do we track every case that's coming through and how do we sequence to know what we're dealing with. The one thing that is very concerning is the South African variant. And I know that we've talked about this before. There are concerns that this variant might not fare well with the current vaccines that are in distribution. The good news, and to reiterate where science and technology have come together and really have been able to advance, is we can now take a look at that variant and create a new vaccine or a booster if needed. So again, more to come on that within the next week. Next slide. And so just a few other updates I wanted to get out today, and again, more communication next week, is really looking at the new vaccines that are in the pipeline. Currently, J&J has one, right, where they're looking at getting the EUA for distribution. We'll talk a little bit more about that. What is an adenovirus vaccine? What does that mean? What's the mechanism of action? What do we know about this vaccine in particular? And I want to reiterate, the two mRNA vaccines and the J&J vaccines have 100% efficacy for hospitalizations and deaths. And that's the one thing we don't really talk a lot about. We talk about the efficacy of developing symptoms, but really when we're talking about the significant and severe impact, all of these are very highly efficacious. Now, more to come, right, where the variant plays into these. We'll also have updates next week about our second phase of the distribution and what does that look like for us getting access to the vaccines in long-term care now that we've gone through the first phase. And I also wanted to highlight that, again, Avamere is really leading the way during this pandemic nationally. We are partnering with a data analytics and platform group out in Chicago, developing a reporting platform for the CDC that was presented last week. They're very interested, and we're going to be doing a pilot internally to see if we can get the information that we need to know about this pandemic from all the testing that we are doing to the number of patients and staff that have been vaccinated, and then the amount of testing that we do after to really track and trend what are next steps for us in long-term care, understanding if we've been vaccinated, how does that change our reopening plan? How does that change PPE usage for staff? How does that change the testing requirements or how we cohort? So a lot more to come on that next week, and I'll have some updates. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about, which is a common theme and a common question and a very common concern that people have, especially in our industries, understanding, should I get the vaccine if I want to become pregnant or if I am pregnant? And as of yesterday, a recommendation just came out that really talked again and highlighted ACOG and the Society of Maternal Fetal Medicine, where we know now that pregnant women are 70 times higher risk for COVID infection. We think it's really related to the fact that women tend to be in roles right now in the workforce that are out in communities, from healthcare workers to teachers to the food industry. And so you are more at risk for contracting COVID. And with that said, you are more at risk for severe disease of COVID if you contract it when you're pregnant. We've also talked about in the past too, if you contract COVID while you're pregnant, that you're at risk for preterm labor. So again, a lot of focus on really educating women who are pregnant and the risk versus the benefit of getting a COVID vaccine. So I would encourage you again to talk with your physicians if you're contemplating becoming pregnant or if you are pregnant and want more information about the vaccine. And then last but not least, we're going to have some stories from staff about why they got vaccinated and maybe some unique situations and what they want to share with the rest of us after they got their vaccine. So with that said, I want to pause and again, take a step back and thank everyone for the work that you continue to do on a daily basis. We've been through a very long change in this industry and the impact that it's had to our seniors that we care for and care about. And we've talked about this as a marathon, right? And sometimes it feels like we've hit the halfway mark or we're reaching Heartbreak Hill. And those last few miles sure are exhausting. And I thought it would be important to invite Dr. Polo here to talk to us about mental health and wellness and resiliency during this period of time. So Dr. Polo, thank you for joining us today.
So Liz, thank you very much for inviting me. And Thomas, thank you for that nice introduction. I'm going to go ahead and project from my laptop. Is that okay? So let me just make sure.
Should be.
So it says that I've been disabled from sharing because I'm going to share my slides. Is that okay?
Yeah, I don't know why you'd be disabled. I do have your slides right here. If you want to tell me when to move forward, I'm happy to do that for you.
Which ones do you have? The latest?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, go ahead. And how about if you share and I'll just tell you to advance each slide. Would that work okay with you?
Works perfect for me.
Works for me. Just go to the first slide. All right. So first of all, you guys at Avamere are in a very, very challenging position. At the same time that you're charged with really taking care of so many others that happen to be in a vulnerable population, you've got a lot of concerns probably that relate to both yourselves and your families. And so it's very timely to kind of think about the impact that this might be having. You probably have read in the media all about, the challenges with quote, quote, mental health and how people are dealing with and being impacted by stress. The reason why this is significant is because you're going to see after I go through the initial part of this presentation that more than likely the long-term outcome from this pandemic will have a far greater impact from an emotional mental health perspective than it will from a medical perspective relative to what the actual COVID infection really causes. Now, Liz did a wonderful job. Dr. Burns did a wonderful job of setting some context, but I do want to review just two slides. So let's go to the next one. Here's this first slide, which just basically shows, and this is almost the exact same numbers I think that were shown on Liz's slides, total numbers of folks that have been infected thus far and the total number of people that have died. Now, for a reference point, I want to point something out. The total numbers of folks that have been infected in the United States is only 8.3%. Just so you have as a reference point, that's less than the number of people on an annual basis that usually get the flu. And the deaths, the total number of deaths, 484 as of yesterday, 484,000. That's just a little over 0.1%. Now, once again, for reference point, that's 10 times the number of deaths that we normally see annually from flu. So the point here is that depending on which data you look at, you get a different shading of the impact of what's happening. But we're still early in the process, which is why I want to talk about that, because part of understanding the approach to mental health is thinking about how you're going to play the long game. We'll get to that in a second. Now, if you look at the second slide, Liz also covered this as well too. roughly 57 million Americans have been vaccinated with at least one dose. And one dose of the two vaccines does confer some immunity, although to maximize for both the Pfizer and the Moderna, you really need both. But even with just getting one dose, that 57 million represents really only about 12.4% of the total population. You probably have heard from Liz before that for us to reach herd immunity, you have to get upwards of 85, 87% of the population immunized. And while it looks like we're off to a slow start, but a good start, the reality is we probably won't hit herd immunity. For a reference point, we never hit herd immunity with flu. And in fact, flu herd immunity is kind of irrelevant because we need a vaccine each year to account for the mutations. This is not necessarily a given with COVID, but the likelihood that we're going to hit herd immunity is actually not very high. Okay, so it's important to think about these two things as we then move forward to think about mental health. So let's go to the next slide. It's important to understand really what are we talking about in terms of what this pandemic is in terms of the experience. The pandemic is, for all practical purposes, a natural disaster. Now, you will read many different definitions, but the basic definition of a natural disaster is an event that causes serious damage to either our social infrastructure or serious numbers of deaths and loss of life that affects our emotional infrastructure. And disasters require a concerted community effort to recover, and invariably, in some way, shape, or form, exhausts resources. Now, a couple of things to point out. We've experienced many disasters in our nation. In fact, we experience disasters every single year to the tune of about 300. They're usually local, or in some cases, regional. What makes this particular disaster unique is two things. First of all, it is a global disaster. So it is literally happening everywhere. So trying to get a concerted community effort has to occur on many different levels: small communities, regional communities, national communities, global communities, continental communities. There's many different ways to look at this, but there's no one part of the globe that is currently unaffected. The second thing that makes this incredibly difficult is this is an evolving disaster. So think of a plane crash, think of a significant fire. These are disasters that usually occur in a short period of time. They finish, and then the recovery process starts. And sometimes that recovery process is long, so sometimes it's short. But if you think about it, this particular disaster is continuing to evolve all along the way. Where we are today is nowhere near recovery, even though we're a lot farther along than where we were back in March when we first declared national emergency. Now, when folks are struck with a disaster, their initial individual response is one of confusion. Usually they're trying to understand, well, what's happening? So lots of questions erupt. People make lots of assumptions. They try to make predictions on what they can do or what they should be doing or what others should be doing. And all of this creates a lot of anxiety. Anxiety over time creates fear. And I'll get into a little bit in a moment on why that becomes so important. Now, when you take a community and you then put everybody together from a community-based perspective, or even from an organizational perspective, where everybody has this initial response, the problem now becomes magnified. People are confused in different ways. People have different questions, different assumptions are being made, different things are being done. It can lead to tremendous, tremendous challenges for the community at large. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the key with disasters is uncertainty. When a disaster happens, there are many unknowns. And uncertainty is about trying to figure out and make sense of what is actually happening around you. So what you see on this slide is a list of key questions. These are by no means all the questions, and they're not in any particular order. But when folks are dealing with an uncertain environment, they start questioning everything. And there's a basic reason for that. As humans, we are hardwired to be vigilant. We are constantly assessing what's happening around us for the purposes of being able to plan and deal with whatever is happening. It's part of our survival instinct. And when you have disasters, it really touches on that survival drive, because oftentimes in disasters, our actual physical life is threatened. Now, in the slide right next to it, when you look at a disaster as it unfolds over time, this is what it looks like in terms of disaster recovery. Disaster recovery, remember, is about getting to where you want to be from where you are. And sometimes you never get to go back to where you were. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Now, in our particular case, one could argue that we did have some pre-disaster signs and symptoms. We knew that there was a virus in China as early as January. In fact, it was talked about in the media. But notice nobody was able to foretell the significance of what that would mean to the nation, or even less so to the world at large. Even though epidemiologists were telling folks, this is a pandemic, it's coming, you need to prepare, and people still didn't quite get it. Usually what happens with the initial impact is, and I'll show this, let's jump to the next slide a second. Usually what happens on the initial impact is folks, first of all, they minimize what's going on because that's a protective mechanism trying to not feel that they're at risk. It's almost as if you see things in front of you that are dangerous, but you minimize their real impact so that you can emotionally actually handle what is very significant. We also tend to simplify what's happening, and we do that so that we can make sense out of it. And with those two things in place, we jump into action. Humans love to be doing something because it feels productive. And oftentimes in a disaster, a lot of that early work is for naught. It doesn't really do much of anything to improve anything. And in fact, if you think about it right now, our whole focus is very different in terms of vaccination and getting folks to comply with vaccination and want vaccination, so on and so forth. All of the concerns that we had back in March and April are very different from a public perspective. They're not different from a public health perspective. They're not difficult from an epidemiological perspective. But in terms of what the average individual that's struggling with this disaster, their focus is completely different now. Now, disillusionment phase, and it's still on that little graph in the top left corner, is that long trend down, because what's on the y-axis here is emotional kind of feeling, emotional resilience, the ability to handle what's going on. It goes down when the reality of the severity of the disaster sets in. Now, keep in mind, sometimes with disasters, a flurry of activity does help. You're able to, mobilize resources, particularly if the disaster is in one area. You can bring resources in from an area that's unaffected. War is a great example. If you have a lot of injured people in one area, you can move them to where there are medical resources, or you can bring medical resources in. Okay, so the reality that sets in with this disaster is it's everywhere. And so there's no ability to turn anywhere else to kind of fill the gap of what people are experiencing. And that's the reality of the situation, which generally creates a tremendous amount of disillusionment, particularly if there are unknowns, because one of the resources that you run out of is knowledge. And one of our early resources that we did not have was the knowledge of vaccination. Will we be able to develop one? If it's developed, will it be effective? If it's effective, will we be able to produce it? If we produce it, will people actually take it? So those were earlier questions, and now we've shifted to slightly different questions. When folks are going through a disaster, then the emotional responses generally track in this order. Initially, these are irritability, usually followed by some anger, which is part of denial. Over time, this creates anxiety. And anxiety unchecked can create fear. Let me tell you why that happens. As humans with a survival instinct, we generally think about worst case scenario. Two reasons. If we can plan for worst case scenario, and prevent it will survive. Second reason is if we identify what worst case scenario is, then frankly, everything else just seems easy because it's not as bad. The problem is in real life, worst case scenario rarely happens. So you can have a tremendous amount of fear that goes unchecked, creating tremendous amount of stress that's uncalled for based on your own assumptions, your own fears, your own concerns. When a disaster situation persists over time, some folks transition into a sense of helplessness or a sense of hopelessness or even become depressed. And in fact, the long-term impacts of disaster usually does create a group of folks that are emotionally impacted, far more significant to the community at large than the folks that were impacted from the physical nature. And in this particular case, the actual impact of getting infected. If you think about it for a moment, the numbers of folks so far that have had serious COVID infection and died is just over 0.1%. So think about that. Just over 0.1% of the population. It is currently estimated that roughly 40 to 50% of the entire US population is suffering from significant emotional strain, of which many of them have an identifiable mental health disorder. It doesn't mean they're dysfunctional, and it doesn't mean they won't bounce back. It means they're simply impacted in a way that their lives are affected. Let's jump to the next slide. All right, mental health oftentimes creates a little bit of anxiety when you just talk about it. There's a lot of stigma attached to mental health, and I won't go into that. But mental health is not good or bad. It's simply where you are at any given moment relative to how you're doing with what's going on around you. So if you're highly stressed and struggling, then your mental health is going to be a little bit more impacted, and you may be more to the left on this graph toward the direction of illness. If you're doing well, handling stress fine, not really being impacted very much, then you'll be more to the right. And at any given point, you can move along this axis. And at any given point, some folks can get stuck. So mental health is not a good thing or a bad thing. It's a description of where you happen to be at any given moment. Now, why is this important? All of us struggle with stress throughout life. The prevalence of a mental health disorder, and I'll show this on a different slide, is about 1 in 5. So at any given point, 20% or more of the entire population is suffering with some kind of mental health disorder, and that's without a pandemic to even think about. Resilience is about suffering from stress, but being able to bounce back to your baseline. Consider when you've gone through a period of time in your life, whether it's been a short period, a week, a day, a few weeks, where you've struggled with something that was very difficult that impacted, but you were able to get through that or recover from that and bounce back. That's our inherent resilience, our ability to withstand stress, not avoid it, simply withstand it. Our mental health affects our interactions with other people. We are driven to be in connection with other people. It's how we tend to address most of our needs through relationships. And when you're stressed, those relationships generally suffer. It also affects the choices that you will make. And these choices can be both social or occupational. Generally, when folks are highly stressed, their choices will reflect, not their best judgment. They will sometimes be a little bit more risky. They will be a little bit more cavalier. They might cut corners, or they might do things that otherwise don't necessarily make sense. And finally, productivity on an individual level is affected when you have challenges with mental health. And productivity here is not really just about work. Obviously, we think of productivity in terms of how you're performing at work, but productivity is also how are you performing in your social life? How are you connecting with other people? How are you taking advantage of activities that you like? How are you balancing all the things that you need to do, whether it's family, work, and the like, and that gets impacted. So in the end, your mental health, your state of being is really about your quality of life. And so it's highly important that we think about, well, what do we need to do about this? Let's go to the next slide. A little bit of information on pre-pandemic. many folks will tell you, and I've been a practicing psychiatrist for over 30 years, we've had a mental health pandemic in this nation going on for years, okay? High prevalence, 1 in 5, widespread stigma, which prevents folks from coming forward. We have a very limited workforce. It's very challenging to get in and get help from somebody. Not everybody needs a psychiatrist. Many folks really just need a friend, and some folks will need a counselor. But struggling through to find somebody that has the professional skills can all by itself be a huge challenge. Our system is not built well. You probably have seen this relative to where you fit into the picture in terms of managing older individuals when they need some kinds of services relative to mental health, in terms of how you connect them across the continuum of care. And frankly, we've put many barriers in place, largely due to stigma, but also because of cost factors that make it hard for folks to even get the help that they need. So how could it get any worse? Next slide. This is just a quick, oh, there we go. Let's see, did we skip one slide? No. Did we skip one slide? Can you go back a second? Maybe I skipped it. Oh yeah, it's on the right there. Just want to highlight one thing, because I'm going to touch on this in a moment. Notice that in addition to, quote, mental health having a high prevalence, notice how alcohol and substance abuse is pretty significant as well too. Not as bad, but 1 in 12, and 40% of the population have both. We traditionally talk about mental health as being those things that are emotional: depression, anxiety, obsessions, etc., versus substance use, of which alcohol is the predominantly abused substance in the United States. But obviously there's many illicit drugs, and there are also prescriptive drugs. But substance use disorder is highly tied to mental health in terms of either leading to mental health problems or the result of mental health problems. So let's jump to the next slide. For a reference point, the top 3 emotional stressors that generally lead to a mental health problem, this is before you even think about a pandemic, are problems with other people, problems at work, or problems with money. These are the 3 things that I go looking for to assess what is creating stress in an individual. So what has COVID caused? Well, what's interesting about COVID is the very things that we are promoting to limit and prevent infection spread are actually worsening the very things that generally cause emotional stress. So social distancing, which has occurred in a couple of different ways. It's not just being away from people that you're normally connected to. It's also feeling trapped within small environments of people, which are sometimes more stressful. You may know friends in a family where they're all together, and frankly, the tension goes up, and now they don't necessarily have the ability to kind of escape from that tension. So social distancing all by itself has had a huge impact on all of our relationships. Work changes. Now, you guys are essential workers, caring for other people. You have had to be at work throughout the entire pandemic so far, but you've had to make many changes on how you do your day-to-day work to account for COVID, not only for the patients that are in your facilities, but for yourselves as well too. If we take a broader look at it from a community perspective, there are many people, unfortunately, that have lost their jobs. Some folks that can't work from home, or their jobs aren't essential, or the entire industry is dried up. Restaurant industry, flight industry, hotel industry, and so forth. And of course, any disaster creates money problems. Look at the financial hardship that we're currently having. And I would suggest to you, although you may not know this, the financial hardship that is going to be significant from this pandemic is actually probably not really hit just quite yet. So this pandemic is a perfect storm on a grand scale to create a tremendous amount of emotional strain for literally everybody. All right, so what do we do about that? Let's jump to the next slide. Uncertainty is the key to disaster, but uncertainty actually is there all the time in our lives. And one of the things that you have to remember when you're dealing with uncertainty is you have to take things in small bites. Now, dealing with uncertainty can be done from an occupational perspective, but you can also think of this from the lens of a social, personal perspective. And ultimately, it's about focusing on just the things that are right in front of you and the things that you can actually control. And with those things in mind, then making some decisions on what you should do, knowing full well that you may be making a decision that's not the right one. If you make a decision that's not the right one, chances are you'll figure it out and you can change. So I'll give you an example. I've spent the last 10 months talking to many groups. Many folks, as an example, have been very frustrated with this whole masking thing. It's amazing how culturally different states look at it in very different ways. So one of the suggestions I've given to folks is, hey, look, the recommendation is that you wear a mask. That's really the recommendation. It's based on science. It's coming from the public health and medical officials. Some jurisdictions across the country have come down a little bit harder on that versus some others which have not. But what I tell folks is, hey, look, if that's something that's bothering you, stop worrying about whether you should or shouldn't wear a mask. Instead, follow the rule of wearing the mask, but make a game out of it. You can choose which mask you want to wear. Do you want to wear a colorful one? Do you want to wear one with your favorite football team on it? Do you want to wear a different mask every single day? It doesn't change the fact that you have to wear a mask, but it changes your perspective on being in control of something that you still have to handle. So it's a slightly different perspective. In general, when you have a lot of uncertainty, you have to kind of move forward toward the uncertainty in terms of being positive, curious, kind of brave, knowing that there are going to be some unexpected challenges that come along. Now, what's important when you do it from a community-based perspective, and this becomes important when you're in a large organization like Avamere, is to think about how do we all get through this together. If this pandemic has taught us nothing as a nation, it should have taught us, it is teaching us we have to work together as a community of communities, because we're all impacted and we can either all work together to survive and get through it, or we can't. So these are some of the tips that usually help folks, particularly in smaller groups, to be able to weather challenges. One of the things that's most important is communicating repeatedly. Notice how Dr. Burns went over all the updates on where things are nationally. And my guess is she's done this repeatedly over time. It does a couple of things. It demystifies the information, it gives you a credible source of accurate information, and it gives you peace of mind that you now know what's there and you don't have to spend hours digging through to find it somewhere else. You don't have to make assumptions. You don't have to ask questions. You have the information that is necessary or that is critical to understand. It doesn't mean you have all the information, but you have the information that's currently available given to you. So communication is a huge part of getting through things together. It's important to make sure that you have that framework of what can I do to help others, rather than thinking about what can others do to help me. The more you give, in essence, the more you will get back. Now, part of the problem, next slide, is that when we're going through a significant event, a significant disaster, there's all kinds of change that happens. There's a famous saying that, people hate change. This is actually not true. People love change when they're in control of it. And in fact, we jump on doing things differently if it's something that we feel there's something in it for us. Where we don't do well is when change is occurring that we weren't in control of. All right. Now, for us to be able to survive through an evolving pandemic, we're going to have to get used to the fact that many things will indeed change. And these are some tips on how to deal with that. First of all, change creates stress. So if you're feeling stressed, welcome to the group of normal people. So don't stress about being stressed. And I can't tell you how many people get worried about being worried. They get worried that they're anxious. They get worried that they're having difficulty. They get worried that they're having that's just your body's natural response to having stress. Now, it's okay to say, what can I do to take away that stress? What can I do to handle that stress? But it doesn't make any sense to get stressed about the fact that you are stressed, because stress is a normal reaction. In fact, currently during this pandemic, I worry a lot more about people that say that they're not bothered at all. People that say that they have no stress, people that say that's nothing bothering them, people that say that they're not afraid of anything. That's actually not a normal response. Finding the humor in any situation can be highly, highly effective to kind of let down in a moment, which is good for your emotional well-being. Humor is considered a very high-level coping mechanism, particularly when you can poke fun at yourself or poke fun at the people around you in a playful way that gets folks working together. So despite the fact that the situation may be difficult and hard, finding those few moments of humor can be highly effective, and there's nothing wrong with finding humor in a bad situation. I'm a psychiatrist, love it, talking to people about their feelings, but this is a time when I remind folks, don't get lost in your feelings. Your feelings are a reaction to what's going on, and what's going on is real. So if you want to talk about your feelings and kind of share where they are, that's okay. But you don't want to spend all your time focused on what you're feeling, because that's likely to be a spiral of doom that just goes downhill. Focus on values over fears. I talked earlier about the fact that we tend to assume worst case scenario. Oh my gosh, the variant South African is going to strike the country and everybody is going to die. Well, the reality is there have been 4 cases of that variant in the United States recognized as of, I think it's yesterday, okay? And it turns out so far that while there's some concerns about that variant, we don't necessarily know that it's going to have a significant impact in the long run. It could, but it also might not. So getting afraid of that before we have the knowledge is not going to help you. So what are the values that you can focus on in relationship to this? Well, the value of encouraging folks to get vaccinated, the fact that vaccination does help, may not be 100% for each individual, but as Liz highlighted, it is virtually 100% right now for severe illness and death. Okay, we haven't seen any cases of severe adverse outcomes once they've been vaccinated, and we didn't see any of that in the trials, which is why they were actually approved. So don't focus on your fears, focus on the facts, and focus on the values that you're tied to in terms of moving forward. You need to accept the past and then let it go. What do I actually mean by that? So I was very bothered when restaurants closed. I like to eat out. I'm older now. I don't have kids at home. I don't like to cook. My wife doesn't like to cook. We like to go out. And presto, overnight, it was just gone. Okay. Sounds like it's a simple thing. And to some, maybe it is. But the point is, change creates things where sometimes something that you really liked, you have to let go of. I call it the good old days. We always talk about the good old days as if something was in the past that we really missed. There will be a future, I guarantee you, where today will be referred to as the good old days. You just don't know that yet. And of course, with change, the key concept that we always talk about is accepting the fact that there'll be more change. All right, just a couple slides here, and we'll close up and open it up to any questions. What everybody should be doing, if you want to just back up here a second, I think we skipped one slide, but what everybody should be doing, first of all, the best thing that you can do is, first of all, take care of yourself. We're in a caring business. You're spending every day caring for other people. You will not be effective caring for other people if you do not take care of yourself. And I guarantee you, the residents at Avamere aren't taking care of the staff. So you have to take care of each other. You have to take care of yourself. The basics are always important. Eating well, sleeping well, getting plenty of exercise. In fact, those 3 things alone are the best things that you could do to boost your immune system. Ironically, that would help you in the sense that it would help limit or prevent your risk for infection. If you become exhausted, if you're not eating well, not sleeping well, If you're getting deconditioned, your body actually will become more at risk for any infection, to include COVID. I talked earlier about the fact that we are relational beings. That's been one of the challenges of COVID. So maintaining relationships, whether it's using, social platforms, Facebook, whatever, what I generally tell folks is you want to carve out time and make it a priority, connect to other people one-on-one, where you can actually see their face and they can see yours. And don't talk about COVID. You can share the updates, but move past that and talk about things that are meaningful to the two of you, or that are things that you both enjoy, to maintain that sense of connectivity to other people. This is particularly important for folks in facilities, particularly for elderly folks who currently are struggling with a tremendous amount of sense of isolation and feeling pulled away, not only from their usual connections, but from society in general. And that happens to many folks in facilities, even without the presence of a pandemic. Resilience. There's many things, many resources online. I wasn't going to go into great detail on this. Things that you can do for yourself, whether it's practicing mindfulness, whether it's exercise programs, yoga, a tremendous number of things that can help alleviate stress, irritability, and so forth. That is not rocket science. That will help you essentially deal with what's in the moment, the stress, so that you can bounce back to get to your baseline, whatever your baseline happens to be. From a work perspective, sharing with coworkers and supervisors, and of course, getting help if you actually think that you need it. Next slide. A quick comment on alcohol. Typically during disasters, alcohol sales go through the roof, and that has not been any different during the pandemic. Made worse by the fact that these days you can get just about anything delivered to your door without ever seeing another person, to include a case of just about any alcohol you so desire. Okay. I won't go into a long diatribe on the challenges of alcohol and substance abuse. What I will say is, in general, alcohol is a problem if you're trying to use it to change how you feel. And there's two ways that this happens. People are trying to feel something that they don't. Hey, I don't feel excited. I don't feel motivated. I always have more energy when I drink. I'm just going to drink so I can feel better. Or they're trying not to feel something that they do feel. I feel horrible. I feel alone. I feel sad. I feel blue. And when I drink, it goes away. Those kinds of approaches to using alcohol invariably put you at risk for potential problems. Ultimately, in some cases, it can lead to addiction. And in fact, we're seeing booming sales followed by a lot of relapses, demographically shown through statistics. I won't go into that detail, but I thought it would be remiss if I didn't mention that. Next slide, which is right there. Post-disaster psychology. One thing I want to mention about this real quick. Let's go back a second. I'm sorry, based on the slide there. Usually, when it comes to disasters, in a time-based approach, it usually works what this first column looks like. In the first 3 months of a disaster, the predominant sense that the community is feeling is one of anxiety. In the second 3 months, it's one of depression. And after 6 months, people really begin to adapt. The grand majority of people adapt. They accept the change. They're not happy with it, which is okay, but they're able to thrive and kind of move forward. From a population-based perspective, the grand majority of people are resilient and do fine. Some folks will have something that happens and then they recover from it. I'm talking about from an emotional perspective. Maybe they go through a period of severe anxiety, they go through a period of short depression, but then they recover. A very small segment of the population becomes what's called the affected cohort. These are the folks that have some kind of impact to their emotional well-being or some kind of impact to their mental health. And even when the event or disaster is resolved, that still persists. That actually affects a very small proportion of the population. Why do I mention that? Because if you're feeling stressed, or if you're seeing family members that are feeling stressed and struggling with symptoms of anxiety and depression, rest assured the overwhelming majority of those folks will get through it and they will adapt. Next slide. I do want to mention, though, and I won't go into a lot of detail about this, mental illness is very treatable. Treatment is largely available. It can be difficult to get treatment, but it is largely available. People do recover. One of the basics, if you're being impacted such that you can't get back to your baseline, your job is being affected, your relationships are being affected, you can't sleep, your appetite is changing. If any of those kinds of things persist over time, that can be a clue that maybe you need something more than just friends. Maybe you need something more than just personal resilience building. You might need to see a counselor. And my recommendation is touch base first with just your regular primary care doctor. Now, I do want to mention two things about kids here. So kids have been struggling, and they are often the forgotten ones in just about any situation. We tend to think of kids after we thought about the adults population. So a quick review here. What's the purpose of childhood? Purpose of childhood is for kids to grow, have experiences, and learn so they can leave your home. That's the purpose of childhood in a nutshell. What's the purpose of parenthood? Well, it's to feed your kids so that they will grow. It's to expose them in a safe manner to different experiences and teach them all the things that they need to learn so that you can let them go. And I highlight this because parents are struggling with a number of things. How do I keep my kids safe, first of all, from this, infection, even though we know that kids are relatively unaffected from a population-based perspective. But nonetheless, parents are worried about that. Don't want my kids infected. Also don't want my kids to pass along the infection. But we've got all these other things that are on hold for them. School, activities, schooling at home, et cetera, so on and so forth. So what are some tips for kids? I won't go into the tips about schooling just because we're kind of through that. But if you go to the next slide, these are the basic tips that will apply to all kids. And I use the word kids here loosely because for some of you, kids may be, in their young 20s. I know there are plenty of college kids that have had to return home. And although they're, quote, adults, in many ways, they are emotionally or sometimes behaviorally still like kids. Rules are very helpful to children. It gives them a sense of expectation and it gives them a sense of security. Routines are also very helpful. And when you're not having to go to school, it's easy to let some of those routines fall by the wayside. So setting routines, encouraging kids to learn through anything. Now, I'm not talking about math, I'm not talking about science, but using what's available from a tools perspective to encourage learning, whether it's about what's happening in the state or something that they might be interested in, medieval history, whatever. Why? Because learning encourages creativity and it gets their mind focused on something other than the disaster at hand. Talking with your kids really means listening to them. Kids at different ages will have different fears. They will have different concerns. And before you assume that you know what your child is afraid of, listen to what their concerns are and then talk to them at their level to give them realistic reassurance, not unrealistic reassurance, but realistic reassurance. Kids need boundaries and they will break those boundaries usually so that they can prove to themselves that those boundaries are actually really there because those boundaries create a sense of safety. So you want to make sure that you're setting boundaries that are appropriate for the context, i.e. a socially distant world, and appropriate for their age level, which gives them a framework that will hopefully contain their behavior. Expect challenges. That's what kids do. They break the rules, they break the boundaries, they're constantly testing their limits. Kids also have lots of emotions that sometimes get expressed in their behavior. There's nothing wrong with having emotions. Sometimes their behavior needs to be reined in, but you should expect your kids to be a little bit more volatile during this period of time, and consequently their behavior may not always, be what you want it to be. Provide reassurance. You may find that you have to repeat things over and over. They're slow to understand their own feelings and they're slow to understand what you're trying to get them to do, but they will give it. But most importantly, give yourself a break, because you don't have to be a perfect parent. So sometimes the path of least resistance is the right path. For example, you catch your child, once again at 10 p.m., on their telephone, chit-chatting with a friend, and you're too exhausted to have that argument yet again. It might be better just to go to sleep and not worry about it. Nothing bad is going to happen usually because a child happened to stay up late one night texting on their phone. All right, returning to a new normal. You probably heard about this over and over and over. New normal is occurring every single day, and we don't even know what the final new normal will be. Whatever it is what it's going to be. But I highly doubt it's going to be exactly like the past. For example, I can't imagine ever again going to the grocery store without taking out a handy wipe and cleaning off the handles of the cart. And in fact, in my case, I've almost wondered, why didn't I do that before? So remember, there are going to be new things coming down the road that we will change, that will be permanent, but we'll adapt to them in a way that makes it okay. Final slide. Normal has changed for everybody. We're in this together. It is perfectly normal to be anxious and worried about what's going on. Limit your exposure to the very thing that might be creating stress. So if you're doom scrolling or doom surfing, if you're spending all day reading the media reports on the latest variant or the latest vaccine, you're probably wasting your time at the expense of only having more anxiety. You can probably learn everything you need to know by simply listening to Dr. Burns once a week, or listening to the news, 5 to 10 minutes a night. But actually things change very slowly. So limit the very thing that's creating anxiety. Whatever that is, figure out what your triggers are and limit them. Instead, connect with family and friends, talk openly, certainly include your feelings, but as I said earlier, don't get stuck in those. Think about the things that you do control. The rules, the recommendations, none of us control. They are what they are, coming from the CDC through the various states and their health departments. All of us, myself included, should just follow the rules. Those rules are to help keep us physically safe as a community. And finally, amid all of this, lots of good things are happening. Take a moment to practice gratitude, give thanks for the things that you do have. Everybody will get through this. So those are all of my comments. I don't know if there have been questions in the chat or questions that people might have, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. I know we're close on time, so I want to be respectful of that.
Thank you, Dr. Polo. Really appreciate it. And apparently I have a lot of emails to return. So sorry about that at the bottom, everyone. It is what it is today. So not going to worry too much about it, but I'm sorry for the distraction there. So we do have some great questions for you. So first one is, Dr. Polo, thank you for this excellent information. Do you have any recommendations for us as healthcare workers who have had a far greater impact from COVID in our jobs and the illness and death associated with our communities? What are some things we can do to keep morale up during our fatigue?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. First of all, I would not presume to kind of tell your leadership what to do, okay? One of the best things an organization, though, can do, depending on who's asking the question and where you fit into the question, because everybody's a leader, is, first of all, just recognize that folks are under stress and that they too need some accommodations. Working flexibly with schedules, giving people a break, given that we know they have to, manage kids, or they have to, take care of activities at home and so forth. A supportive leadership that recognizes that there are challenges goes a long way to helping employees feel like, okay, so my leadership cares about me. And the reason why that's so important in the healthcare industry is we focus on taking care of other people. We focus on other people's needs. And sometimes we need to feel that there's somebody trying to take care of our needs. So when it comes to an employer, that's where an employer can really step ahead and kind of help employees internally. Now, you can do that as a supervisor. You can do that as a team leader. You can do that as an executive director at one facility. It's not about what others can do for you. It's really about where can you have an impact to the people around you, okay? There is no question that people in healthcare are more stressed. That there's just no question about that. And the other thing that's important is encouraging folks to take time off and to balance. Have good boundaries of when work starts and when work ends, and make sure that people are taking care of themselves in their off time and getting rejuvenated themselves.
All right, thank you very much. And Dr. Burns, you're going to have to help me out with this one because I might screw it up. But will we see an increase in the diagnosis of agoraphobia? Hopefully I don't.
Great question. So agoraphobia is like fear of other people, not wanting to be in large crowds and so forth. So first of all, the prevalence of all primary mental health disorders have never been shown to increase during disasters. Bipolar doesn't go up, schizophrenia doesn't go up, OCD doesn't go up. None of those things seem to be impacted. The one diagnosis that does seem to go up is post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's really very individualized based on what an individual actually feels. There are some people that will develop significant symptoms related to PTSD simply because out of fear of how they experience the situation. Very simple example, you send somebody off to war, they come back, they had an injury, they don't have PTSD, they do fine. You send somebody else off to war, they never had an injury, but they come back and they have significant emotional turmoil. Their experience within their own mind was quite different. I give you that longer explanation because I can't actually tell you for a fact that prevalence statistics of any of the phobias haven't gone up, but there is no expectation that they actually will. There's also no expectation that any of the primary anxiety disorders are going to go up.
Thank you very much. Great question. Are there templates or information available for folks to help them get started on a plan to set goals and objectives?
Yes. First of all, there are all kinds of resources online. If you have access to one that's called My Strength is it's kind of a CBT self-driven solution. Some companies have made it available. Some health plans have made it available, but it's one example of many apps, that you can carry around on your phone that kind of guides you through positive thinking, making a plan, following through on essentially all the right things that kind of help you look at things more positively and focus in a way that allows you to get through periods of stress. There's all kinds of resources online. Some are free, some may not be free, but that would be my recommendation.
Fantastic, thank you. Any suggestions or prompts to help people to initiate a conversation to increase connection? I see a lot of commentary on social media that people feel they lack the skills to enhance their social network.
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, if you're online trolling Facebook, that's not social connection. That's not what we mean by social connection. So if your little phone is telling you that you were online for 6 hours, that doesn't mean you had 6 hours of valuable use, okay? So social connection is actually interacting with another individual. Interaction with a group of individuals is also a form of social connection. If folks are having difficulty, there's all kinds of resources online that help you get connected through common interests, common location, any kind of challenge that you may be having. There's usually a group of other folks out there that are having the similar challenge, and simply getting together and talking about that can sometimes be helpful. When I think of encouraging social connection, I usually prompt folks to think, first of all, who were you connecting with before, and how are you continuing those connections now? Okay, so how did you connect to family that was far away? How did you connect to friends that live down the block? Those are the first connections that should be the easiest to continue to at least maintain. But it takes effort, it takes planning, and one of the things is you need to prioritize it as something that you're going to do.
Fantastic. Margaret asked this as a clarifying question. I had the same thing. So did you say over 27 million people in the US abuse drugs and alcohol? Is that the statistic?
I can't remember what the exact number is. That actually sounds a little bit low. Okay. 12% of the population is currently impacted by a substance use disorder. So 12% of 332 million is, it's got to be higher than 27.
Where's Kevin Tomlinson? Kevin?
Yeah.
What's the math on that? No, it's okay. No, I believe it's the question. It was just a startling number that I was curious about, and Margaret asked the question too, so I appreciated her asking.
Yeah, no, it is. Here's the point that's important. Substance abuse is far more prevalent than we sometimes think. We don't tend to talk about it. There are many people that are working full time and are able to hide that without a problem. And there are some folks that have a very serious substance abuse problem, and there are some folks that have kind of a not so serious, but still have a problem. No judgment. Substance abuse is a medical problem, and it has some medical treatments available. But the first step is identifying that it's a medical problem that needs treatment. And it usually starts first with the self. If you have a feeling or concern that you might be having a challenge, best thing to do, talk to your primary care doctor and share what's going on. If you feel somebody in your family, best thing to do is just share with them, hey, I've noticed this and I'm worried, without judgment.
Thank you very much. I got a question for me. Is this going to be replayed? So the answer is yes. We will. This is all being recorded, and so we'll get this out to the whole organization. So you'll see it on SharePoint, and then we'll send it out through Avamere Communications. So just to answer that one, and then do you have last one for you, Dr. Polo? At least at this point, do you have any advice for our seniors, specifically living at our communities or facilities, or throughout the organization? We have concern about PTSD for our seniors.
Yeah, so I'll share with you on a personal level. My parents live 3 miles away from me. They're both in their mid-80s. They're in a assisted living facility, a small facility. They've not gotten COVID. In fact, they've both been vaccinated, but they both have significant dementia and have been struggling with significant symptoms of isolation and depression. So I get it. I just want you to know I really understand them. Staff can provide an enormous amount of connection in their day-to-day work as they normally would, even without an ongoing pandemic. Anything that you can do to facilitate their connections, whether it's helping them with an iPad, setting up a good place for that window visit where it's not going to be cold and breezy, so that when family members come, they'll actually sit there. Okay. So, very simple example. My folks are at a facility. I live in the Northwest. It's very rainy. They ended up erecting kind of this covered area, and they have a little outdoor heater so that when people come to visit, you're actually a little bit more comfortable. And that way you don't feel like, after 10 minutes, you're too cold and you need to leave. And frankly, I already know that the staff, they do better when my parents have had a good visit. They do better when my parents feel like, oh, gee, my son came and they care about us, and they, that helps not only them individually, it helps the staff, it helps the entire place. Anything you can do to facilitate those connections without breaking any of the recommended CDC rules is always going to be helpful. And remember, that's something that really, in your industry, you've known that for years long before this pandemic. This is certainly not a new thing. It's simply been made worse by the social distancing and so forth.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Dr. Burns, I got a couple for you. And do we expect an uptake in COVID cases due to extreme weather across the country, which caused people to shelter in place? Obviously dealing with it here in the Northwest. And so the example was similar to like we did during the wildfires. So do you have any feedback on that? You're muted there, my friend.
Thanks. I still have the same issue too, Jim. So it's a great question, and I always seem to have great answers in that I can always talk about time will tell, right? That's my standard response to everything, but there's a dialect here with this, right? So a couple things can happen. One would be because of the extreme weather, people are sheltering in place and therefore not being out in the community and having transmission. So we could see a decline from that. We could also see an uptake because of the extreme circumstances in people needing to leave their homes and get together with other people. We could potentially see a rise. Then we also have to factor in the impact of not being able to get vaccines in arms. What did that do, right? So of course, the fact that those clinics that have been canceled, right, that is going to set us back in our trajectory. although I'm reading, and some of you might be more ahead of this, that it might just delay it by a few days, and that the vaccine supply was already there. But what we anticipate is several weeks down the road, because of issues with manufacturing, product, and distribution of driving new vaccine, throughout the country where it's been severely impacted, we might see some issues a little bit further down the road than we had anticipated with getting those vaccines into arms. So again, my standard, unfortunately, response is time will tell. We'll need to see the data, and once we do, we'll know what the impact was.
Awesome. And last question for you. It's a similar question we got last week, but it's an important one. Walgreens informed me yesterday that they will not be offering the first dose at the third clinic. Is this consistent to what you're hearing, Dr. Burns?
Yeah, so I don't know who sent that question to you. So Melissa Bruce had actually sent an email communication last week because she had received an update, because we continue to hear conflicting information. And so the latest that I'm understanding is in the state of Oregon, they're saying that first dose, third clinic is not going to happen. However, the communication that I have had is, even though they're saying that, still reach out to your pharmacy representative, because if there's an extreme circumstance, they're going to try to find a way to do it. And again, I continue to encourage you, if you've already moved beyond your 2 clinics and you can't get it on your third one, community-based care, and I see Sarah, you're on the phone right now, you guys still have second clinics going on. And so it's about reaching out way ahead of time to make sure that you might be able to get in that line for the second clinic. And then, the communication that Melissa got in the other states from Walgreens is that they would be doing first dose at the third clinic. But again, it's frequent, constant communication that you need to be having with your long-term care pharmacy partner, just making sure everybody's on the same page so we don't have these one-offs and surprises like we've experienced over the last couple of weeks. So good question, and just continued communication, right, is so important on all levels, on all topics, because things do change, as Jim said, on a daily basis, right?
Absolutely. And Sarah, you made a great point. Just to go back to some of Dr. Polo's questions he was getting. So our employee assistance program through Cascade Centers offers some excellent resources for goal setting and mindset training that is available to everybody in the whole organization. So a great resource to probably jump into there. Dr. Burns and I will be doing a recording next week to give some updates on vaccinations, clinics, everything associated. Hopefully we'll have some fun too. We will get that into your hands next week, as she suggested, but I want to take the moment to thank Dr. Jim Polo for joining us, and of course, our esteemed Dr. Burns. Thank you to you both. Any parting words for you, Liz?
Again, I just thank you, everybody who's on this call, and for your teams. We are really walking through, history here. We are on the front line. We're on the cutting edge. A lot of what we do often is what sets the tone for what the rest of the country is doing. And it's because of all the work that you do on a daily basis, the things that you're finding that work and don't work, things that you need, the way that we're communicating between one another. I just really want to tell all of you how much I appreciate the work that you do on a daily basis. And I also want to thank Jim for coming to the call. Time with you is always valuable, and I'm sure we'll have a few more follow-up questions for you that we'll be sure to send over. But again, thank you for your time. It's good to see you.
Oh, you're muted, Dr. Polo.
You're on mute.
I was saying thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it, but I want to thank all of you at Avamere. Dr. Burns is so right. You are at the cutting edge for a very vulnerable population, a population that sometimes is forgotten. And it's important. It demonstrates caring for society in the way that you care for the people in your facilities. I can't thank you enough. I know what it's like to have a older loved one and wanting to make sure that they are really cared for. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much to you all. Everyone be well, have a great day, and we'll get this recording out so you can send out to your team members, family members, anybody associated with you. So be well, everyone. Have a good day.